let's say, the cosmopolitan nature of the city, the extensive trade relations that the city had with different parts all around the Mediterranean, and that here is just a small example of that. But let's get into the actual material that's significant. Again, this is a slide that was put together by Gerald for a different conference, but I'm, let's say, using it here. This gives us some insight into, let us say, what starts to happen in the, let's say, first quarter of the 2nd century BCE. What you have here is what's referred to as the Heliodorus inscription.
I'm working on something, but I wanted to join this Idumean talk.
Sorry, okay. 3 lower pieces were discovered by us in our excavation. This piece was robbed from the same area. Our pieces gave this provenance. Most importantly, what we have here is the Heliodorus stele is describing, let's say, the situation in the region, specifically, let's say, in Mauritius and also Judea, post, let's say, the Treaty of Idumea, the, let's say, tribute that the sailors had to pay, or let's put it differently, the economic hardships, let us say, that I'd say the Seleucids felt. And this more or less is echoed in the 2nd book of Maccabees, chapter 3, where we talk about Heliodorus is going into the temple to take the taxes or the money from the treasury. I'm sure people understand or know the full story there. I'm not going to relate to the piece on the left, but it's just simply a second copy of the same stele. I'm skipping through things quickly because I have a lot to show you, and I'll leave a lot for just the questions or that may come up later. In the 2nd century BCE, we start to see a steady decline in Mauritius, and many different, let's say, industries start to partially fold. So if we look at the 84 columbaria that have been identified, 54 of them are decommissioned. Decommissioned meaning they were either, the dovecotes were quarried through, meaning it was no longer used, or they were filled with debris dumped from the surface. You also have 28% of the olive presses also put out of use, quarried through, no longer being used. And I would say, most importantly, almost 40% of the cisterns in Mauritius were decommissioned. Now, what this shows, at least to me, is that what we see is I'd say, an increase in emigration from Mauritius. Not all at once, but certainly during the course of the 2nd century, when all of this political and economic turmoil was going on, basically people start to live. And this is echoed also in Gerald Finkelstein's work on the dated Rhodian amphora stamps, where you can see the same kind of phenomenon taking place here, where you see a tremendous decline in imports, again, reflecting more or less, let us say, the decline in trade and probably what took place, the political instability that was going on at that period of time. Now, what you're looking at right here is a sense of what Mauritius looked like. But really, the main point I want to, let's say, emphasize here is underneath all of these homes, there were subterranean complexes. And those subterranean complexes were accessed via staircases, via dromos. And what we have found is that of the 320 odd systems in the 152 complexes, 181 of the entrances were blocked. Now, most of that blockage, again, 131 of them, or 30%, appear to have been the result of alluvium, things that flowed in over 2 millennium, that was just kind of dumped, and that's what you see more or less over here. There's the entrance behind me and behind one of our staff. But what's kind of interesting is, and maybe even more significant, is that we have 50 systems. It's only 12%, but 50 systems that were deliberately blocked by built walls, like you see in the different, let's say, photos that I have here. That suggests that some people had time to close up their basements, perhaps even believing there was a future possibility of returning. 12%, but nevertheless, again, this falls into what I believe is a steady emigration going on in Mauritius during the course of the Second Temple period. Now, if we want to address the whole issue of the siege, the battle, the conquest, we have 187 weapons that we have found. But keep in mind, these were found in 13 subterranean complexes, different complexes spread out. So really, we don't have a concentration of weapons. We can say that the walls were breached at a certain point. We simply have a mixture of different types of weapons, from the stone projectiles, the ballistas, the throw stones, copper alloy and iron arrowheads and spearheads, and about 10 lead sling bullets. One of them was found in a burnt area, and the person who was excavating this area near area 920, Débora, believed it was possible that was, let's say, remnants of the siege. But again, this is a hypothesis. I'm not sure how much we can go by that. Now, what is kind of significant, and the final report on Area 53 that you see over here is being written, and hopefully it'll come out this year. Basically, you're looking at a room that is, or a house, I should say, that's very different than, let's say, what you see in Hebron, where you see a lot of evidence of fire and destruction. Here, what was found was a home with considerable amounts of pottery on the floor, suggesting that the house was deserted rather quickly, perhaps explaining also why this juglet was found underneath the floor, and within it these 25 silver tetradrachmas, which were identified by Rachel Barkai, and the latest date on them was 112 BCE. This is significant. This is the beginning, not the beginning, but it is certainly one of the factors that determined for a long time that 112 was the terminus antiquam of the city. Moulton had published in 1915 a tomb inscription that gave a similar type of date. Dalit Negev, also more recently in tomb 500, found a similar latest date there. And all of this was accepted, and this is what we were publishing for a while. Gerald Finkelstein at a certain point was investigating and did a report on the lead weights that you see here. And his initial, let's say, conclusion was that it was dated to the Seleucid date of 205 or 108, 107 BCE. This was done in 2010. Most of us were then changing our publications, and that was the date that we accepted. And even up to a year or two ago, until Gerald's, let's say, revision of the date to 113, 112, and that is more or less the accepted date. Even our ceilings, the bulok that we discovered in the archive in Subterranean Complex 89, the latest bula is also from the same date. So I think that we can say confidently that the city was conquered and abandoned, or mostly abandoned at least, in 112, 111 BCE. Now, is there evidence of post-conquest habitation? We're going to believe that from this point, we're going to get into a lot more questions and answers. But the bottom line is, we might ask, show me the money. Is there anything that we can see that will answer that question? Well, Bliss and McAllister, we know, found about 25 Hyrcanus coins, but statistically, that's not terribly significant in terms of the over 1,000 coins that we have. In terms of post-Hyrcanus coins and Hyrcanus coins that we found since then, the numbers, as you can see here highlighted, are relatively insignificant. Even Alexandrianite coins, which are usually in abundance in areas that were, let's say, ruled by him, here we have 4 of them. And so we can say that the numismatic information is showing us very, very little. Now, this is a very quick review, but I think it's important. We have the sources. Josephus tells us that after the conquest, the Idumeans basically submit to the use of circumcision and the rest of the ways of Jewish life. But at the same time, we have a number of different issues that we have to at least confront. We have the discovery of at least 17 chalk circumcised phalli. These are, again, Semitic features, not necessarily only Jewish features. And we do read in the biblical text of the Idumeans or Edomites practicing circumcision. But then we get to the baths. Again, we saw those 2 baths on the tell that were identified by Bliss and McAllister, or let's say more exactly identified by Ronnie Reif. We have 77 purification chambers or baths in the lower city. Now, Now, what are these chambers? Well, again, here is a surface layer. You would go down your stairs, and then you'd have your 2 baths. 96% of the baths are next to cisterns or in the vicinity of cisterns. And these are, in my opinion, purification baths or ritual baths that had some sort of cultic purpose. You would fill a bath through it. Someone would fill it from the outside. It would go through a channel like you see here, and eventually lead to a bathtub or a, let's say, some sort of a bench that one would sit on. So it seems like it had some cultic purpose. There are similarities, of course, to, let us call them Hellenistic hip baths or relaxation baths, or Phoenician bathing suites, but there's also significant differences. And if we have time at the end, when we have questions, I'll be happy to go into those differences. Over 1,000 vessels that have been punctured, resembling Mishnaic laws of purity. Mishnah Kelim talks about it. I'm not going to get into it now, but again, another similarity to what we would see in a Judean site, but in the Roman period. And in addition to that, we have pig avoidance. All of this, okay, in addition to that, oscillegium, anaconic tendencies, etc. What does this all mean? Okay, it suggests very strongly that the Idumeans will convert, perhaps, but the conversion is simply changing the symbolism of things that they were already doing. And in fact, I think that there was a sharing going in both directions, that the Jews will also, or the Judeans will take from the Idumeans maybe as much as the Idumeans are taken from the Jews. Or to put it in different terms, let's say Bezalel Porton said that we are not unjustified in speaking of a Judeo-Idumean piety. Okay, this was a syncretism of cultures in a very eclectic community. Now, what's interesting also is that there are 9 altars or, let's say, cultic niches that clearly were deliberately disfigured or damaged. This is probably, again, post-conquest by Hyrcanus. This shouldn't be that surprising, and we do know the Hasmonean policy towards pagan religions range from intolerant to hostile, and that's exhibited in the destruction of the pagan temple in Samaria, the destruction of Hebron, and other areas right next to Marisha as well. What kind of habitation do we have? Is there anything happening post-Hyrcanus? Well, here you have, this is one of the bath. This is the bath over here, what we're looking at. And after the time the bath was no longer in use, someone made a couple of burial niches in this area. There's one over here. This is another one over for here. And according to the survey that Amos Kloner did there in the 90s, he claims that there was pottery there that was late Hellenistic and early Roman, and that there were also fragments of ossuaries in this room. Again, we do not have that material. Okay, we could probably somehow track it down, but at the moment, all we have is that mention in the survey. What's missing? Who's living here? Someone is living there. Someone was, let's say, using those niches. Who were they? Well, it appears because we don't have those Hyrcanus coins, we do not have Hasmonean cooking pots or pinched lamps. What we don't have here is a Hasmonean settlement. In other words, in what we might call southern Idumea, or below the area of the Valley of Elah. North of there, you have settlements. South, it doesn't seem that way. So what we have here is, well, a big question mark in terms of who are these people who are living there. Again, there are not a lot of them, but it seems that somebody was living in this area. And the question marks continue. If we're talking about Marisha of Gabinius, okay, we have a literary source. We have Josephus who talks about the city of Gabinius there. We have a couple of coins not found in situ that suggest there was a Marisha of Gabinius. And we also have the story of the destruction by the Parthians. So all of these things suggest that maybe there was such a city, but where would it be? Well, so far, at least in the excavations in the lower city where we've been working, there's no sign of that type of pottery. Underneath Beit Guvrin, which was the suggestion that the late Professor Amos Kloner had, basically I spoke last week with Micha Cohen and Alain Hubsch, and they basically said there is no pottery before the 3rd century Common Era there. So we could possibly eliminate that. And then you have the possibility of something referred to as Khirbet Marash. Khirbet Marash is something or a site that we see in lots of maps coming from the late, let's say, 19th century, early 20th century, even actually mid-19th century, where there was an Arabic ruin, okay, called Khirbet Marash, not far from Tel Santahana / Marisha. And we see it on a lot of different maps. And that basically created I don't know, enticed myself and Dr. Mickey Osband to start to conduct surveys in the area. So we did one 2 years ago with some of the students. Last year we didn't, and we intend to go back. So far, all of the material that we found has been Byzantine, but let's say we're hopeful. Jump to the Great Revolt. First century, and again, you have a literary source. Nothing, as I said before, according to the excavators in the area of Beit Gurion, that can be dated to that early period. However, in the Second Temple period, in the second century, things start to change slightly. That is to say, there's just one example, but there are 7 subterranean complexes that all of a sudden they have burrows kind of moving away from them. Okay, so these are burrows that, as you can see one example right over here on the right, and these burrows very much resemble Bar Kokhba-esque tunnels that were used in the battle when the Bar Kokhba fighters were fighting the Romans. Now, do we have much in the way of remains from that period of time? Not much, but let me even go back for a second and just say that normally, when you find this phenomenon of tunnels, of burrows, they are usually built underneath, let's say, areas where there was some sort of a settlement. In Subterranean Complex 89, right down, the archive is right to the right of this whole structure here. In different rooms there, we found a number of Roman oil lamps. We found a casserole. In other areas around Marisha, this was found by people who were, let's say, surveying the area, but not an official survey, I have to say. All this is more later, but this is certainly in the earlier period. And I would say that this suggests that there was some people living there, but it was rather sparse. Which brings me, okay, I'll try to get into past a little bit of the 20 minutes, but to summarize, okay, Marisha was clearly conquered by Hyrcanus in 112, 111 BC. We have that confirmed. Number 2, the Idumean population seems to have accepted the laws of the Jews, which entails, in my opinion, this changing simply the symbolism of pre-existing practices, maybe even influencing the Judean rituals at the same time, and becoming part of the Judean polity. Hellenistic Marisha is mostly abandoned, although there's still sparse information about, let's say, some sort of people or somebody living above, although who that was, don't know. Some of the Idumeans clearly moved, we have clear evidence of that, moving to Egypt. Marisha of Gabinius remains a mystery. It impacts on where and what did the Parthians conquer. Beit Gurion mentioned, but again, where's the evidence? And Second Temple city seems to hint, or second century remains, hint to a small population during the Bar Kokhba revolt. In other words, after years of excavating in Marisha and Beit Gurion, lots of questions remain. What became of the Idumeans after 111, 112 BCE? They certainly maintained some sort of ethnic awareness, at least what we can read from Josephus. You have the Costa Bar affair, but the fact that a family will name their child with a theophoric suggests a certain amount of ethnic awareness in and of itself. Of course, his whole, let us say, attempt at a coup suggests also that there were those Idumeans who wanted to, or still maintain some sort of, let's say, Idumean consciousness. In addition to that, you have Herod sending his garrison up to Trachonitis, you have the War of Varus, you have the Great Revolt, all of these things involving Idumeans as well, and the Kos altar at Mamre that was found by Magen. In other words, just to finish up, I think that the Idumeans worship the Jewish God in Jerusalem, but their homeland, with its specific, let's say, local customs, remained in Idumea. Or to paraphrase Yehuda Halevi, perhaps their hearts were in the south. Thank you. Hello? Is anybody there?
Thank you so much, Ian.
Hi, Boris.
Hi, Boris.
I went through that very fast, and I apologize for trying to jam in so much into a relatively short amount of time, but I will be happy to elaborate on any of this when we get to Q&A later.
Yeah, we will do it after Debbie's talk and after a comment and note from Boris. So thank you so much, Ian. And please let's move on to the next talk. Ian, if you can please unshare your presentation.
There you go.
Okay, we're moving to Debbie Sandhaus, a postdoctoral fellow at Beersheba University of the Negev. She's a senior member and director of the publication of the Hebrew University Tel Hatzor Excavation Project. Her research is focused on human behavior as it reflected by material culture, especially pottery in its spatial, chronological, and social context. Her recently completed PhD, The Nexus of Cultures, the Shefelah during the Persian and Hellenistic periods, explored the Judean-Idumean dynamics in this formative moment. Debbie, the floor is yours. Hi.
שומעים?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I would like to thank Roy and Rotem for inviting me to participate in the late Maccabees workshop. The expected lecture would have had to be Idumea during the Hasmonean period. Lately, both Faust Ehrlich and I wrote about the abandonment of the sites in the northern border of the Shefelah, resulting from the Hasmonean conquest. Lately is 2018. It's not so lately, actually. However, having a vague notion about what happened in the entire Idumean realm by the time, I was really excited to engage with the task. My primary premise was, and still is, that people do not vanish. There is not such a thing as an empty land. Keeping this in mind, I was sure I was going to find traces of these people in the nearby area. Let me now introduce you to the path I've been walking through this last month. The Idumean topography during the Hellenistic period extends more or less to the north to the Haifa Valley line, to the east with the southern Judean desert, to the south with the Beersheba Valley, and to the west with the line of the little east from the shore. It included the fertile land of the mined hills of the Shefelah, climbs up the Hebron area, and the southern hills, the southern Judean desert, and the northern Negev. And we can enter after that through the borders, but in general. Roads cross the area, connecting it with the topographies of Judea, Lod, Gaza, Ashdod, and with the Nabateans in the south. The lowlands, a fertile area with mined hills, nice weather, as we say today, the Tuscany of Israel, was an agricultural area where the agricultural activity was and still is a major economic field. The city of Maresha, as Ian showed us previously, was somehow abandoned by the end of the 2nd century BCE. I would love to see the squatters occupation that Ian talked about it. And until now, a Hasmonean occupation was not seen in the site. Few Hasmonean coins on the Tel are evidence of the conquest, but not necessarily of any occupational level. Next to Maresha is Beit Gobrin, and there is, as Ian already showed, the earliest remains are from the 3rd. In one of the records, written records, there is a vague record of the Jewish village of the 1st century CE, but there is nothing supporting that. And we are moving fast to Khurbat Amuda and Beit Lehi. These both sites are in the proximity of Marsha, and they are dug by Oren Gutfeld, Michal Aber, Pablo Betzer, and Yaakov Kalman. And I am very grateful to them because they are sharing with me all their information, and I can check the pottery. And the results are that Khurbat Amuda is an amazing ritual compound that was 3 different phases were uncovered. The end of the occupation is in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. Remember that we will discuss about the temples or the ritual compounds at the end, because most of them, their occupation ended by the middle of the 2nd century and not by the end, like most of the other areas. Beit Lehi or Beit Loya, again, it has an occupation from the 3rd to the 2nd century BCE. After that, it's reoccupied by the 1st century CE. And again, lately with Bar Kokhba revolt associated complexes. The next 2 sites, Khurbat Midras and Khurbat Itri. Midras was excavated until lately by Orit Peleg Barkat, and she published several preliminary reports, but we spoke, and Shulamit Terem is working on the pottery. There is evidence of a 3rd, 2nd century BCE phases of household and quarry activity, and the next occupational level will be for sure after somehow during the 2nd half of the 2nd century CE. Khurbat Itri, it's a fascinating site. It was dug and surveyed by Ganor, Siso Beikar, mostly, and Klein joined them. It's a very unusual site, and we will speak about how unusual it is at the end when you see the pattern. What is happening there is that, according to the excavators, they uncover a village which has a fantastic preservation. Through the excavation, 3 different occupational phases were identified. The earliest from the 3rd to the 1st century BCE. The 2nd phase, the most significant phase, when the city was developed and enlarged, dates to the 1st century CE. The excavators mentioned that it seems that the site was abandoned shortly, and the new occupation between the revolts is seen in the evidence. By now, inhabitants, squatters, refugees built the synagogue and used the subterranean systems as hiding places. The destruction of the village is associated with the Bar Kokhba revolt. So, to remark, it's the first site from all the sites that we've seen, and from most of the sites that we will see, that has a substantial, significant phase of the 1st century BCE, and there is a continuation between the 2nd and the 1st century BCE. Next, Amatzia and Hirbet Rasem. Amatzia is a satellite village of Marsha. Hirbet Rasem is an inn or an estate that was dug by Avi Faust and Adi Ehrlich. and they were both occupied during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, and they were abandoned by the same time as Maresha. Next, now we will start running. Hellenistic Lachish included the residency, the solar shrine, the city walls, and the gate. There are some controversies about the date of the erection of some of the structures. All agreed that the structures were in use during the 2nd century BCE until the mid or the late 2nd century BCE. Next, new, just from the oven. Lately, Sarganor and Bloody Leaf Sheets dug Lachish Fortress. Is a fortress that is very close to Marsha, and Ahinoam Montegu, a student of Yana Chechanovets at Ben Gurion University at Beersheba, is writing her MA on this site. According to the excavators, the collapse yielded a large number of complete vessels dating to the 2nd century BCE. The last coins are those of Antiochus VII, associating the destruction to John Orcanus or to Alexander Yanai. According to Ganor, a line of similar strongholds spread westward, but they are not dug yet, and I am very, very thankful for SAR to allow me to publish and to speak about an unpublished site. Now we'll turn south to the Beersheba Valley. The Negev, on the contrary of the lowland, is a desert or a semi-desert region in southern Israel. The Idumea Negev spread through its northern part, which is the more Mediterranean zone that receives 300 millimeters of rain annually and has fairly fertile soils. Tel Sheba. There is a temple, a fortress, and domestic buildings that are associated with the Hellenistic period. 2 phases were excavated in the temple, dating to the 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE, and the second dated to the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE. Very early 1st century BCE. The excavators proposed to associate the earliest temple with the cosmopolitan eclectic cult, and the second phase with the Yahweistic temple, probably as a result of John Hyrcanus' I reform. After a conspicuous analysis of the evidence, the pottery, the objects, the stratigraphy, and the numismatic evidence, I was going to suggest that both temple occupations should be ascribed to the Idumean inhabitants, and it is the destruction of the shrine which should be associated with John Hyrcanus. But then I read Orenthals' review, which is essentially what I said a minute ago. So I actually agree with Oren completely. We both, from each one from its own direction, we checked the same things, we saw the same objects, and we came up with the same conclusion. After the abandonment of the site, the next occupational level is represented by a bathhouse dating to the 1st century CE. In this slide, I want to show you 4 small salvage excavations in the Beersheba area. They are a farm, a village, 2 structures, all occupied by the 2nd century BCE and abandoned at the end of the century and left unoccupied. We do have, after that, things that are pretty late. In the same area, by the 1st century AD, new sites or sites that were occupied in the Iron Age were settled. The most impressive is Rakafot, where a nice village with a watchtower, cistern, ritual bath, subterranean systems was erected and was destroyed probably by 135 AD. At Tel Ira, 3 occupational phases are associated with the Hellenistic period. the earliest reused walls of the Iron Age stratum. During the 2nd century BCE, the inhabitants of the site reused the Iron Age structures, the defensive wall and adjacent rooms, alleys, and new domestic units were built following the Iron Age plan. According to Fisher and Tal, the site was abandoned by the 2nd or very early in the 1st century BCE and reoccupied only in the 1st century CE or in the second half of the 2nd century as proposed by Malka Herskovich. And now I want to make something clear. As Tal himself noted, the pottery range of the assemblage is mostly dated in the 2nd century BCE, though based on the appearance of Eastern sigillata A vessels and the Punic amphora, which date range is between the late 2nd and the early 1st century BCE, he proposed a wider range for the whole assemblage, although it lacks clear markers of the 1st century BCE. However, he states that the association of the abandonment of the site should be set during the end of the 2nd century BCE as the result of the Seleucid policy response toward the Hasmonean conquest. And I brought the pottery here as for the pottery experts that are sitting and hearing can see by themselves. The next slide is an example of why I don't like to rely on surveys in order to answer the kind of questions we are addressing. When trying to figure out transitions between periods, one should be extremely careful with the nuances of the datable material. So let's take a look. I read in one of the surveys that there are 4 fortresses and several strongholds associated with Hasmonean activity against the Nabateans. So I was thrilled and very excited because I started to see the path that was coming up, and I was trying to see where all these people were in the 1st century BCE. So it turns that 2 of the sites that was written Hellenistic and Roman period, the pottery was revised by Jody Magnus, and there was not a single Hellenistic sherd. Most of the pottery was very, very late. In some other of these fortresses, there were Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine pottery sherds. So how come you associate it with a fortress or with an Hellenistic fortress or with a Hasmonean fortress? It can easily be a Roman fortress or a Byzantine fortress. So I was so desperate to find these people, so I passed over surveys, lots of surveys, and I couldn't really find them. So the next slide is an example, Tel Malchata, Aroer, and Hurbat Utza show the similar occupational pattern. Occupation through the 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE, abandonment by the end of the century or very, very early in the 1st century BCE. The abandonment is usually associated with John Hyrcanus I or with Alexandria I. The next occupation dates to the 1st century AD. Tel Arad, a temple and a fortress, both destroyed by the end of the 2nd century BCE. Now we move to the east, to the hill landscape of Hebron and the surrounding hills. At this point, I was really kind of desperate. Beit Zur. Okay, Beit Zur, as you can see in the slide in front of you, was associated, reassociated, and again to whoever actor was mentioned in the sources. However, the pottery and the numismatic evidence, as you can see below, as I revised it, show that there is evidence of a 5th, 3rd century BCE phase, a 2nd century BCE phase, and then just a sec. And here we again have the late 2nd, early 1st century BCE abandonment. Hebron. Hebron was largely excavated and is being published lately by Emanuel Eisenberg, David Ben Shlomo, and Rachel Bar Natan, among others. A clear stratum dating to the late 4th, 2nd century BCE was excavated. But to our concern, for the first time, we do have two clear phases, well documented, dating to the 1st century BCE. The first includes a pit and silk context. The second, ritual bath, a cistern, and the stepped street. When I mean pottery dating to the 1st century BCE, this is what I mean. The pottery is accompanied by coins dating to the late Hasmoneans and to Herod also. So this is what we haven't seen until now. Maybe in Khurbat Itri, but they didn't publish it yet, so we don't know. But this is what we call 1st century BCE assemblage. In the area south of Hebron, in Susia and Ruchum Melamiri, Yuval Baruch wrote his PhD 10 years ago, and actually he wrote about all the area south to Hebron, on the hills south of Hebron. So we do have an occupation from the 3rd to the 1st century CE. From the 3rd to the first half of the 1st century BCE, there is a farm on the area west of the synagogue. In the second half of the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, there are major remains, walls, installation, ritual bath, pottery, numismatic, stone objects. A similar picture in Rujum El Amiri, evidence for 2nd century BCE, pottery and numismatic, a fortified estate as he identified the remains there, are dated to the second half of the 1st century BCE up to 135 CE. So I know that this is really, and there are a lot of other sites. A similar picture we can see in the Judean desert, in sites such as Masada, Herodium, En-Gedi, and Bukek. The area has a significant growing settlements that some were settled before and others were erected during the Hasmonean or Herod's time. So what I want to share with you, I know that it's very, very, very small, but as you can see, the two remarked columns are those of the 1st century BCE, those that are associated to the Hasmoneans or the Herod period. As you can see, I divided the sites between those in the Shfela, the Negev, as you can see in front of us. With the exception of Khurbat Itri, there was not observed such an occupation. Now, in the southern hills and in the Judean desert, we do see that during these periods, there is meaningful, some kind of occupation during this century. So now I invite you to an open discussion about what the pattern of occupation we've seen show us, where the people went to, what happened with these people. And before we answer, and just to, through a thought, I want to show you the last slide, which shows the excavation of a fortress dug in the, not in the Idumean area, but in the Nabatean area, and is associated by the excavators to the Hasmoneans. So what do you think about where the Idumeans went? What happened with them? From what I can see from the pattern that I showed you, is that the area of Hebron and the southern hills was the one that continued to be occupied, or that was reoccupied. Why was this the pattern? I think this is the moment we should open a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for this wonderful talk and the questions you raised. Before we open the floor for questions and discussion, and maybe as a way of opening it, I want to give the floor for a second to Boris Kubasek, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Toronto, and one of the leaders of a new project called Sealings and Lives of Maresha, to give us some notes and maybe kind of lead us to the discussion. So Boris, please.
Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry for joining a little later today. I mean, Ian and Debbie have given us the very big questions about Idumea and Maresha more closely, about things that we still need to ask and the things we just don't know. Our project, Seals and Lives of Maresha, and I'm grateful that Ian and Donald, who are key collaborators of this project, are here. Catherine Stevens can't be here today, but some of the students are here today. So this is great. Takes one tiny aspect of this very large complex and tries to ask historical questions about it. And our project is about conserving and publishing the Ian and Donald always write about 1,027 seal impressions that were found by Ian in 2018 with his son at the excavations of Maresha, and placing them into the context of, I mean, first of all, we want to publish them both digitally and in print, and Donald is responsible for the identification of these seals, and he's working on it and doing wonderful work. And the key questions are, what do these seals tell us about the last generation of Maresha before the conquest of Hyrcanos? As far as I know, and Donald can correct me in a minute, is that the last year we have attested on the seals is again 112, and this bears questions. But placing these seals within the context, does this archive tell us something about life in Maresha more broadly? About, I mean, who did it belong to? We don't know. How does it compare to the other cultural encounters that we encounter in 169, in caves 89? And then also more broadly, how does this archive compare to other archives in the region, Skytopolis, Tel Kedesh? We will be performing chemical analysis on some of these seals, so we also hope that, similar to Anastasia Shapiro's work on Skytopolis, and where we see where she associates the origin of these sealings, through the chemical analysis, we hope, and with a much larger corpus, we hope we'll get some clearer and perhaps broader answers about whom this archive was in contact with. And in the broader question, we also want to ask, we have seals of the Seleucid Kreophylax in the collection. And so one of the key questions for the project will also be, what is the impact of empire felt in this particular moment, in almost like a microhistory scale, in one specific spot, in one tiny room in Cave 89, in a very specific moment in time. And we hope going forward, I mean, first of all, we need to do these things, but we hope going forward that that will also enable other questions to ask about some of these very important questions that Ian has been raising about what we know about the later city, but also about Debbie, about the humans of Maresha and the Idumeans and this time period they work in. But I don't want to talk too long. I just want to open up the floor for questions, and taking this micro scale, which we're very excited to work on, as one aspect of Idumean history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boris. So now, everyone, please, the floor is open. I already saw earlier some hands. So yes, I see the first one. Tal, please go ahead, and then Sylvie.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you very much for both speakers. This was super interesting and helpful. I have 3 questions, one kind of basic one, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and then 2 questions for each of the speakers, if that's okay. The basic one is basically, if we do away with 108 and we stick only to 112, do we all think of the conquest of Idumea as being very quick, like less than a year at most, like a pretty short order thing? If that's something, that's the conclusion other people are also reaching from this. And the specific question is for Dr. Stern about the kind of Judaic adjacent material. How precisely can we date that? For example, those circumcised phalli and other things. So what is the kind of the range of confidence you have, and how do you date that material precisely? And for Dr. Sandhaus especially, what towns, what sites in Idumea can we think of as towns, archaeologically speaking, other than Marissa? For example, Tel Ira, I know some suggested should be seen as a town or a city. Is Hebron, is anything else, what, the non-rural things or less rural things? So thanks, and thank you both.
Ian, do you want to start?
Yeah. Ian, or Debbie?
I think Dr.
Ian,
Stern
I
is
think you're
muted.
Yeah.
All right. All right. In terms of dating, all of the subterranean complexes that I've spoken about are really unstratified. So we really don't have, let's say, specific dates. What we can say is that it's after the conquest. It's before the conquest. Okay. Let's say the vessels we can date for sure, but again, so the vessels are more or less a mixture, but most of it is, let's say, 2nd century material. But some would be 3rd, and that's almost that would be a constant if we accept the idea that these vessels had some sort of ritual function. Again, I'm not suggesting that they were concerned with, Tumah V'Tara, with purity laws. We don't know what they were doing with those vessels, but there's too many to ignore. The phalli are, let's say, less, again, same issue in terms of dating. It's unlikely that Jews were making, or Judeans were making graven images, so it's most likely somebody else, possibly the Idumeans. And the function of it, again, someone asked the question, I think, in a chat, and I'll just answer that it could have been connected to fertility. It could be connected to some sort of apotropaic reason. It could also maybe connect to, let us say, even some sort of votive. But again, we don't really know. The issue is really just the fact that they're circumcised, and even that, I would say there are people, let's say right now, who wouldn't necessarily agree that they're all circumcised. That that's a possibility that we're seeing there is. I mean, I do believe that we're looking at a circumcised phallus, but it's possible that it is another explanation for it, possibly an erect phallus where you wouldn't see the foreskin. But without going into all the details of this, in terms of the baths, also, again, even if one would say that the bath on top are clearly from the plan a mikvah, but 77 in the lower city certainly speaks to a pattern that's going on. And I mean, if you'd like, I can say that they're very different than the Hellenistic relaxation baths. They're not near any heating source. It's not going to be warm water. It's not a Phoenician bathing suite, because those are usually in the courtyard or near the entrance. So really distinctive differences, aside from the fact that the physical makeup of those baths with someone pouring water from the outside suggests some sort of ritual. I don't know if that answers the question completely, but we can go on and on if we'd like. But I think
Thanks.
Debbie...
I was mostly concerned if the dates would allow theoretically these things being in use generations before the conquest and completely abandoned like 50, 60, 100 years before the conquest, like much early, because of the wide range. That's my...
Right. Well, again, we're seeing all of this material as pre-conquest, it seems to me. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that, you know, they would have built 77 baths, so to speak. I mean, and again, these are dispersed amongst many different systems. So it was pretty widespread. And the same thing with the punctured vessels. Those vessels were found in 13 different in 5 different subterranean complexes that we were analyzing.
Great, thank you, Ian. Debbie, do you want to respond to Tal's questions or add something?
First, I want to continue the conversation here, and there are many things that we associate with the Jewish ritual of the 1st century BCE that might, or actually not just the ritual things, but also some habits that we've seen them slightly earlier in the Idumean realm, like columbaria, like some of the table habits. So maybe the ritual bath were part of this Idumean daily life or ritual life that came with them when they were annexed to the Judean realm. But that's another conversation. Yes, my question is that all the sites that I showed you today are sites that are in the generally accepted to be Idumean realm. I didn't bring sites that are not in the Idumean realm because the pattern is quite different. So if you go to the Judean realm, for example, which is going up from the Ayala Valley, you will see a pattern very different, very similar to that of the Southern Hill. You will see a lot of new villages that were settled for the first time in the Hasmonean period, what we don't see in Idumea. So I believe for sure some of these people were new settlers in the Judean hinterland. They were new settlers in they resumed themselves in the Hebron area, where we see new settlements. Somewhere these people went, and we see some of these new settlements in the regions around, and in the Hebron, in the Southern Hill, which I believe we need to think about why the Hasmoneans prefer to settle their new settlements and not in the more fertile area of the lowland. But I believe that the Idumeans were they went in 2 directions, north to the Judean hinterland and east to the area of Hebron, from what we see.
Thank you, Deb. So we have several more questions. I'll now go to Sylvie and then Andrea and Uzi. But please, Sylvie, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks to the speakers. I actually have two questions which are partly related around the issue of chronology. I'm slightly worried about what I see as a tendency to take the date of 112, 111 BCE as a complete watershed. So I understand that the site was conquered at this time, and then okay, so the numismatic evidence is absolutely clear and convincing. But for the rest, the question actually would be what the state of the city was when it was conquered. We understand now that Galilee was more or less a post-collapse society, to use Ian Stern's notion, for 10 years before the Jews started to resettle in the region, and then only in a second phase, the Hasmoneans conquered Galilee. So why are you a priori ruling out this kind of scenario for Marisha? I mean, why cannot we think that the city was abandoned and then conquered? So that's one question relating to the chronology. The second aspect of chronology is about the bath. So I would be interested, that's a question for Ian, I would be interested to know what corpus of comparison you're using. I mean, are you comparing to show differences? Are you comparing also with the evidence from Ptolemaic Egypt? I'm thinking of the brick baths that were excavated in Thebes, for instance, and then, as we know that there were many Alexandrian influences on Marissa, and a handful of what we could call Hellenization. It surprises me that there would be no bath in a highly Hellenized city. That would be exactly a bath and not ritual bath. So again, what are the criteria for dating all what you call the ritual bath to the post-conquest periods? And are you absolutely certain that your corpus of comparison is correct? And again, did you compare with these baths in Thebes? Okay. Thank you.
First of all, I don't think there is a post-conquest inhabitation to any real degree in Marisha. So it would be pre-conquest for sure. Now, in terms of comparing it to other sites, whether it's, let's say, Bernie did a whole analysis of the baths, the Phoenician baths in Ashkelon, and those were usually, and there's, I think, also in Anafa, baths that are Venetian bathing suites, which are usually situated in a certain position, okay, near the entrance of the house or near the courtyard. And none of ours are even familiar or similar to that. Ours are underground, a distance away from the house, which also differentiates them from most of the Hellenistic hip baths that let's say Jonathan Adler did a lot of work on. There are similarities for sure, but generally speaking, the Hellenistic hip baths are baths where you have heated water inside there. It was a relaxation bath, it was cleansing. Here, if you were going to make a bath that was similar to that, then you would have perhaps up above, perhaps in an area where there is next to a kitchen, which is where they're normally located. There's none of these are located near a kitchen at all. There's one exception. Out of all the 77, there was a brazier that was found next to one of them. I'm not sure if it was thrown in or not, because that was from the survey. It wasn't excavated. But all of them really have different characteristics, again, whether it's for relaxation and heating or whether it's for welcoming. Also, there's certainly a ritual involved, because outside of each of the rooms, there is like a spout where someone would have to stand pour water into the spout. The water would then go through a channel, and the channel would then bring the water to either a bathtub. Some of them have bathtubs where people would be sitting, or they would be sitting on some sort of ledge or bench, and the water would spill over them. Again, I'm not going to say there's no similarity, but I think there's a distinct difference. And well, again, whether it is let us say, the turning point or the transitional point for Jews to eventually be using ritual baths, that I cannot say for sure. But we do know that there are really, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, nobody talks about ritual baths in this period of time. We don't have any reference to them being used this early. It seems strange if there was such a structure within the Jewish world, then we would hear about it from some of the literary sources. We don't. In terms of dating, I didn't quite follow your question on the dating in general in Mauritius, so I apologize. If you want to repeat that, I'll try to address it.
No, okay, you said before, but that was the question also about the state of the city, or perhaps for Débora, the chronology of the abandonment of the sites. And then the implication would be to know what was the situation of the region at the time of the conquest. I mean, did they conquest demographically and economically successful region, or collapsed region?
Well, again, what I pointed out in terms of the coins, the lack of any coins, the suggestion that there would be some sort of Hasmonean presence or any presence there that was significant seems to, there's no evidence of it per se. I mean, again, I would assume there was some sort of scattered population that lived there, but I think that's one of the big question marks, and I think that Debbie's addressed that to a large extent. Where did the Idumeans go? I mean, the possibility of going to Judea. This was Debbie's suggestion, but basically the fact that columbaria start to spring up.
And to the east.
Pardon?
And to the eastern Idumea.
Right, and that they start to move to, all of a sudden, you start to find columbaria being built in Judea at the same time as we're seeing a decrease in the columbaria at Mauritius. It's very possible that this is something that the Idumeans brought with them. It's also possible that, well, I think that that's a very logical suggestion.
Thank you, Ian.
Who's around? I don't know. I think that's Debbie's question, Debbie's field.
Debbie, do you have something to add quickly? If not, we'll move. We have a question from Andrea and
Sylvie, I will answer quickly to Sylvie. I think, Sylvie, that we are not saying that the conquest was in 112 or 111. For sure, to reach the southern area, it will take some time. And I think even Ian said that he saw in the late 2nd century BC a kind of decline in Mauritius. He proposed that these people were starting to emigrate somehow in the middle of the 2nd century BC, which was very interesting for me to hear. And remember that most of the temples were destroyed probably at the middle of the century. So some things are happening. I'm not sure we can be so accurate like in the Galilee. The area functioned at the end of the 2nd century BC. It's a fertile area. It's a very well economic area, but yet it seems that we are starting to see some kind of decline at some point. It's an interesting issue, actually, to check.
Thank you, Debbie. So I understand that Andrea in the room has a question.
Okay, can I just talk?
Oh,
Yeah.
Here she is.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everybody. It's so great to see everybody. Thanks so much to Ian and to Debbie and to Boris. I want to follow up on the line of discussion that we're having about conquest, destruction, continued habitation, so forth, that Tal began with asking, was this a one-shot deal? Was it something protracted? How can we tell? And to offer a suggestion that Ian and Debbie can elaborate or push back on, inspired also by what Sylvie was saying. So Debbie, you're pointing out that it's very, very interesting that the outdoor, rural, communal, religious places of the Idumeans are abandoned prior, significantly prior, half a generation something, to the final abandonment of Maresha. And Ian, you were pointing out that there is quite good evidence in the underground complexes at Maresha for people leaving in a kind of careful and organized way, blocking doorways and creating a sort of clean getaway. And this leads me, and then eventually, or actually in this period, rural Idumea empties out. Debbie, that's what you are showing us. Rural Idumea, the area right around Maresha, empties out. So I want to ask about our continual use of the word conquest. This doesn't look like a conquest. It's described as a conquest, but it doesn't appear as a conquest, especially the final moments at Maresha, where, at least if I was following Ian, what you were presenting to us, we have no evidence of destruction. We have very few weapons. And if it's a conquest, here's my last and burning question. Why don't they move into Maresha? It's really a swell place. It's all set up for a good life. It's the main city of Idumea. Why leave it? So I want to ask Ian and Debbie and anybody else, have we all been seduced by the historical books that use these words that are so black and white and that so immediately understandable to us, and are not therefore reading the evidence on the ground for what it was?
I would say, Andrea, great point. All I can say is that to follow that point further, we can take it way past or right past the Hyrcanus conquest, whether it was a conquest or not. We can also address it to, was there a city of Maresha of Gabinius? Did it actually exist? That's a legitimate question for sure as well. And then, of course, you then have, well, then what did the Parthians conquer, or did they actually conquer? Okay, and then we go on beyond that. I mean, so in other words, this calls in, or let's say the archaeological remains call into question a lot of the literary sources. I just want to add what I said in the beginning, and that is we only have the tip of the iceberg at Maresha. I think we have enough. It's pretty dispersed, so I don't want to say it's not relevant. It's clearly relevant, and it's incredibly rich. But if you think of 5%, there's a lot more to be found there. There's going to be a lot of, let's say, young scholars who are going to be able to move in and start looking at the information and continue the excavation, as well as going back up on top of the tell, which I certainly think requires work. That's not going to happen immediately, but there's a lot more to be done there. And so, as I said from the start, I mean, that was my opening remarks, is when you consider 5%, and that's just my number, but I think it could even be, it's less than 5% of the material being uncovered. There could be many major surprises that are waiting for us.
Great. A comment by Tal in the chat for Andrea, if she wants to react to that, but maybe we also, due to the time, we also move on to Uzi, who had his hand up for a little while now.
Yes, exactly.
I will answer you by phone.
Uzi, before you speak, I have no idea how to raise my hand, my yellow hand. I've never done it before, so I don't know where I have to click.
So we register your virtual hand. We'll get to you. Thank you.
לא שומעים אותך, עוזי.
Yeah, can you try again, Uzi? No, your connection is bad. So yeah, maybe we move on to Boris, and you maybe try on fix it, and we get back to you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to briefly, also thinking about Andreas' point, but also, I mean, respond to Sylvie's question. I mean, I think it's very healthy to have a critical attitude to the idea of conquest and to the idea of dates that we're presented with through the literary evidence. And I think that's very healthy. One striking element at Maresha is that actually that there seem to be a lot of things ending around 112. And that I find a bit surprising and remarkable. But it is also striking that it is precisely in this period of the last 10 years where we don't really know. I mean, Ian described very carefully that in what are the 5% that we see, you can see that there seems to be slightly less going on in a world where, as Abby was describing, rural sanctuaries seem to be abandoned or destroyed. That this is, in a way, this is where our archive sits and seems to be doing its job as usual. We can obviously not date all these documents, only the ones with dates on them. But it will be one of the questions. So can we actually make anything of this, right? This was just a brief remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. So also Donald, and maybe.
Yes. Okay, I might complicate things a little bit, but let me start with what Boris just said. From my experience working on the archive at Kedesh, where we originally thought the sealings were from a whole half century, it turns out that the dated sealings only date to the last 20 years of that archive. It's a huge archive. Here at Maresha, we have the same phenomenon. Which is that the dated sealings that we have a few. They are, again, my first thought when I started working on the Maresha sealings was that it was a half century. And again, we find that the dated ones, again, there aren't too many, are only from the last 20 years. So maybe an archive is a problematic thing, but it does give a sense of the dating, and I have a few other dating contributions here. I worked on the 13 stamped amphora handles from Amatzia, which is I think 12 kilometers away from Maresha, and certainly Idumean site. There is a small hint that they were affected by the activities of Antiochus VII around 136, 135 BC and later. And we have the same thing in Ashkelon, and it could be that there are places in Idumea that don't survive till 112, but Amatzia certainly does, because its latest stamped handle is the same as Maresha, the same 112 BCE date. There is one other site which is Idumean, according to one scholar in 2019 named Marciak, who claimed that Beersheba was a garrison of the Idumeans at its southernmost point. There we also have many stamped amphora handles, and they also go, it's not as clear, but they probably go to the same 112 date. So there are 3 sites that that continue to the end, but there can also be disruptions, as I mentioned, from the Antiochus seventh amphora handles that are found here in the south. The newest discovery I made when I was asked to identify coins from a site excavated 2 years ago. The site was named Chorvat Galgalon. It was publicized a little bit by the Israel Antiquity Authority that excavated it. Unfortunately, in the press release, they said that the Chorvat Galgalon in the Lachish forest was destroyed by John Hyrcanus. In fact, when the coins were cleaned, we discovered that the latest coins, and it's very robust number, not a robust number of coins, but the percentages are robust. There are 15 coins from the Hellenistic period. They start in the beginning of the 2nd century, but the last 9 of them all belong to my friend Alexander Ballas first, Alexander First Ballas. And that means that site, which was destroyed and is evidence of destruction, dates down to 145 BC, a date that a lot of us know here, falling close to the mid-140s that we know from other sites around the region. So it is more complicated. You can have a site that might have been overrun 145, and there probably are more sites that will turn up. The Lachish site, Galgalon, only was discovered 3 years ago, excavated very quickly, one period site, and that's what we turned up.
Thank you, Donald. Any of the speakers want to respond, or anyone? But no, I'll go to Ayala, who had a hand raised. It's still relevant.
Hey,
Don't see it anymore. Hey.
little bit, yes, sorry. Okay.
Okay, I see that you're on the road. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, but I came from another lecture. I want to ask how we understand. I don't have the question. We know from the text that there is very hostility between the Idumeans and the Judeans. And in the lecture of Débora and Jan, they talk about a combination, or I don't have the word, that the Idumean influence on the Judean. So how can we explain this in the background of our discussion?
Thank you.
I just want to add additional issue to the discussion about the text that talking about hostility between these two groups of people.
Thank you. So, Ian or Debbie, anyone wants to respond? I see Debbie has her hand up.
I can answer from a very specific from a very specific aspect of life. So when we say that the combination of the two, or the things that the Idumeans influence in the self-definition of the Judeans, we are speaking about like 100 years after, or 50 years after, when this population was integrated into the Judean realm. So things happen not from one day to the other. So things that I've seen in the Idumean realm before, I will see in terms of cooking or eating or table serving habits, you will see this thing incorporated into the table serving of the Judeans 100 years after, when 3 generations are already being Judeans. You have a king 3 generations after, that is Idumean. So, you know, we're speaking about a process. It's not that tomorrow we hate each other and I will be behind your umbrella and then I will love you. No, it takes time, but then after 3 generations, we see that they are somehow into the society.
Can I add
Thank
something?
you. Yes, go ahead, Adi, if it's
Thank you. So as
connecting to
for
this point
Ayala's
briefly.
question, so first of all, hostility doesn't have to be mutual. It can be that one party sees the other as the, as Edom, the evil, and Esav and so on. The other one looks at them as neighbors. That's one thing. And secondly, I agree with Ian that the Idumeans had some costumes or practices that seem to be very similar to Judean ones, but I think we should bear in mind that they were pagans, and they performed pagan cult, and we can see it throughout the site. So in this regard, they had similarities, but also really big gaps between the two ethnoi. So that could be in the background of the things that we witness.
Yeah.
So
I would agree with also with what both Adia and Debbie said. I think that it is a process, but if you remember what I said before, you had at least, I remember, 8 or 9 altars and niches that were really the Hasmonean response to this paganism. So it's not like that first generation, very zealous, very radical, and as they were integrated into Judean society, I think it was a slow process. Again, but keeping in mind that they didn't absorb all of the Idumeans. At least if we look at once again, we're now have that tension between archaeological remains and historical sources. But if we were to take some of what Josephus says, there certainly seems to have remained within the Idumeans a certain type of ethnic consciousness that permeated through at least part of the population. The majority probably let's say, either continued to be Idumean, or some of them also went to Egypt and maintained that Idumean identity, as we read about in the sources there as well.
Great, thank you, Ian. So we'll now go for 3 last questions, as we're already over time. We'll go to Noah, then Gerald, and then Uzi will give another shot if his connection is better. But please, Noah.
Oh, thanks. I just wrote it. I was worried I had to run. Everyone had to run. But yeah, wondering whether you can see my question. Probably it's better than I can say it. That I mean, I like this idea that maybe the more important event or really development, like Sylvia said, is happening earlier, and let's look for it. And when I saw the Chreo Fulax, I got very excited and interested in understanding the archive. And well, my understanding is it's very hard to associate Hellenistic sealing archives with definitively public buildings, I mean, but one place where you can do that is in Dura Europos, where it's on the Agora, and it's associated with the total reorganization of that city around 150 BC. So it did make me wonder whether maybe the event isn't some kind of reorganization of the city, and that shows up maybe in other kinds of evidence. And where do we think the conjectural agora was? But that I did want to, since Boris, you hit it, that's like what you're really working on and interested in discussing as well. Put that in there. That's my question.
Thank you, Noah.
Done.
Does anyone want to respond, Ian or Boris? Or we move on.
I think we could say that we'd love to think about these things, but we don't know yet. It's a very important point. No, thank you.
Right, we do seem it is a private archive. I don't know if you said that. I think it's not a public archive, it's a private archive, just to kind of, you know.
Yeah, no, well, I'm questioning how we make that distinction, actually. That's I understand. I understand that Donald has thought about this a lot, and I guess my point was, I guess what I said is it's hard to associate Hellenistic sealing archives with public buildings. There's very few cases where you can do that. I know Kedesh is a special case, but like, yeah, if we could say more, but I can look at the report. I can follow up, but yeah, just put a pressing a little bit more on that.
Okay, great, thank you. No, Gerald. You're muted, so unmute yourself. No, still, Gerald, you're muted. And still muted. Yeah.
Yes, I have lots of reactions rather than really discussion because it takes time. But first, let's get rid with the baths. The baths are baths, and there are also some sort of a hammam. By the way, Debbie, how many braziers did you find in all the material of Maresha itself? Personally, I have no idea. Then, of course, many things happened before, and one thing Donald and through the amphora stamps, we could see that Antiochus VII have some sort of a garrison, something very small. I have no idea, and also he may have gotten to Beersheba, and then Balas was mentioned. I mean, we are in a period when there are lots of internal uproars among the Seleucids. And once the sea was mentioned, Ashkelon has exactly the same profile, although with very little finds. But you feel the presence of Antiochus VII and so on. So that's all I want to say about that. Of course, and conquest is not destruction. The only place where we found weapons and ashes is at one of the gates of the walls of Maresha. In short, what you said, Ian, a lot of excavation should be done. The mikvaot, the real ones, and I'll end with this. Of course, they were dug by McAllister, so what can we do? But actually, he found a piece of a table which you find in the Jewish quarter. So these are late ones. This is Herod. So there was some sort of presence. Why two mikvaot? We have to dig there. And I must say that when I was dreaming of things to be done, I think the houses of both mikvaot should be excavated, because if we are lucky, maybe we'll have still material that can help understand it. But for the general abandonment, I think one of the reasons is it's not very peaceful. And by the way, people sealed their houses. I mean, in area 100 and the insula at the bottom, you see it clearly. And you find the amphoras in them. In the building 53, there were 8 amphoras still staying, of course, because they couldn't carry them, which helped us to understand, or helped me first, to understand all the imports that we were receiving in Maresha, and then it's confirmed by other sites too. So it's not too surprising, but again, a lot of work. And we have to see the report of all the pottery to understand Maresha.
Thank you, Gerard. Uzi, maybe we give it another shot to conclude.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for the presentation. I have lots of questions, but I'll just restrict myself to one. To Debbie, questioning the 1st century BCE in the Shvela, the depopulation or the fact we don't see it. Could we maybe be mistaken, because we know very well what 2nd century Idumea looks like, 2nd century BCE. We know very good what 1st century BCE Judea looks like, from Jerusalem, Jericho, and so on. But what does 1st century BCE Idumea look like in terms of material culture, taking into consideration that if there was a continuity of settlement, so it may be buried beneath, and we don't have another Maresha of the 1st century BC in Idumea, so maybe it's a totally different story, and we don't know what to look for at all.
So I follow what you're saying, kind of what happens in Gamla, for example, like continuing with the same material culture. So I went and checked all the sites that I showed you and all the surveys and all the Hadashot Archeologiot that were done in the area. In none of the sites, most of the coins were Seleucid and John Orcanus Echad. You don't find any of the Hasmonean or Herod coinage. And then you see Agrippas and those kind of. So it's not that just the pottery is not there. Also, the coins are not there. And when I am talking about John Orcanus coin, I am talking about 2 coins in the side. So that's why most of the excavators defined it until the end of the 2nd or very early in the 1st. But you don't have this span neither numismatically nor stamp amphoras, because you will have those kind of things in the coast. You don't have occupation. And the next occupation that you see is in general 1st century AD, both by pottery and numismatic. On the contrary, in the Hebron area and the Southern Hill, you do have these kind of things. In the only place that is reported to have these things is Hurbat Itri, but I haven't seen it. That there is a textual verbal sentence, but there are no plates or a catalog of coins. Maybe Donald or Gerald can say about that something, because that it's a very, very striking and surprising place if this is the topic. So I don't know what to say, Uzi. I could have lived very well if they continue to use the same material culture, but I need some coins to anchor it.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. I think this opens up the next phases of our discussions, or leaves us with a lot of questions unanswered, and looking forward to the next conversations. And I'll thank all the speakers and participants on my behalf, and give the floor back to Roy back in Boston.
Thank you so much for the speakers and for all of you who joined us. Our next meeting will be in a month from today, same time, same place, February 28th, Wednesday. We will explore the coast and the Jezreel Valley in the time of the Hasmonean expansion, and we will host Alexander Fantalkin and Matthew Adams to share their thoughts about the archaeological data.
People to send questions if they have questions.
Yes, if you have additional question for the speakers or the group today, please do send them to us, and we will circulate it, and we can continue the discussion, which is very, very interesting. And I myself have a lot to suggest, mostly to Debbie, about this movement of people of settlement pattern from the Shephelah to the hill. I find it quite similar to what's going on in the Galilee, but we can continue later. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.